The NHL trade deadline is fast approaching, Friday, March 8th, and you're going to want to be following the SDPN because we have some excellent content lined up for you. No need to sit around in front of a TV all day. When a trade breaks, the SDP will be posting immediate reactions. Then after all the wheeling and dealing is done, stay tuned for our special SDP trade deadline review episode. And as always, the SDPN is where you need to be as the deadline approaches. The Chris Johnston Show is tapped into all of the latest rumblings, and Basu and Godin have all of your Montreal Canadiens updates. So tune in. Friday, March 8th, the NHL trade deadline is going to be a ton of fun, and the SDPN will be all over it. Follow us on socials, smash that subscribe button on YouTube, and get excited for some massive deals.
I know that some in our audience know the finer points of hockey.
The Chris Johnston Show.
We are your friends.
The biggest stories, bringing you inside the game.
What did you hear?
The Chris Johnston Show.
What is going on?
Here's Chris with your host, Julian McKenzie.
Part of the game.
If you go on CJ's trade board 6.0 at The Athletic, a new number one has emerged, and it's not a member of the Calgary Flames. I believe that's the first time you have someone from a different team at the top of that board. It is Jake Guentzel. Not being said, though, Noah Hanifin and Jacob Markstrom and a whole bunch of other names are there, but Jake Guentzel atop your list at a very interesting time for the Pittsburgh Penguins. They're just coming off two brutal losses in Alberta. A lot of questions about what they'll do at the deadline, but let's start with Jake Guentzel and Kyle Dubas and the Pittsburgh Penguins, and what's next over the next few days for those three entities and individuals.
Well, Guentzel certainly is the most important piece of business, the most important decision in the very short term here for Kyle Dubas and the Penguins. I mean, clearly their most marketable commodity to sell at this deadline. They do have other veteran players like Riley Smith, Lars Eller, and others that are represented on the trade board. But, you know, those guys are not on expiring contracts and are not at the stage of their career where they carry as much appeal as Guentzel does. You know, he was on pace prior to the injury he suffered for an 85, 86 point season. One of the most consistent goal scorers that we've seen in Stanley Cup playoff history. So a big game player, someone who's played with great players, being Sidney Crosby's line mate for so long and a preferred line mate of Sid's. And so when you couple that together, the fact that Guentzel, which is good news, has been skating, working towards his return from that injury he suffered in February. You know, this is a big moment, I think, for the Penguins. They've never been sellers, essentially, in the Crosby era. I mean, maybe in his rookie season when they were still kind of crawling out of the depths of where they'd been. But, you know, you got to go back to like 2005 until a point where that happened. And, you know, there's an opportunity with Guentzel. I think that they've prioritized getting prospects in addition to draft picks because they just have to start filling the cupboard up. And you know, as I mentioned, Guentzel is the player that's going to get them the most back at this deadline. And, you know, it's pretty clear if you're in the GM president seat as Kyle Dubas is what the direction is at this point. I mean, he wanted to give this team as much time as it could to show them what it is. Well, here we are days away from the trade deadline. They've suffered those 3 straight losses in Western Canada. They're 10 points back of a wild card playoff position. I mean, the odds are not at all favorable to them making any kind of comeback. And so, you know, I think that he's got to get younger. He's got to try to free up some cap space. Perhaps as they move towards the off season and, you know, really the most important file on his desk this morning is the Guentzel file as he works through, you know, he's probably the best proven commodity among forwards available if you look across this trade board. And so, you know, that's what's before Dubas. And, you know, I think he's going to end up getting a pretty good haul for this guy by the Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern trade deadline.
What would that haul look like? What would the Pittsburgh Penguins be asking for Jake Guentzel?
Well, I think you're looking at multiple prospects and probably a first round pick, something in that neighborhood. I mean, it makes sense, right? We look at the Elias Lindholm trade as just a recent marker. You know, Calgary gets in that trade a first round pick and a prospect and, you know, a player in Andrei Kuzmenko as well. 2 prospects. So there you go. I mean, I think that something probably a little bit exceeding that trade is where the benchmark would be set. And, you know, I do think you should be able to get it. I mean, teams like Vegas, I think are very important to watch on Guentzel. You know, the Golden Knights have the cap space right now because Mark Stone, you know, suffered a significant injury, isn't going to return before the end of the regular season. they do have prospects in house and obviously some picks too. So, I think that they're a team to keep an eye on here. Edmonton, which we've kind of tracked throughout the season, is very much looking for a top 6 forward, and Guentzel would fit the bill. I'm sure there'll be others here too as we get a little closer. But I would say that at this stage, it looks like the Golden Knights seem to be a front runner in these conversations, and there's still a couple days here for Kyle Dubas potentially to work through the offers and tweak and trade back and forth on which prospects they are. The Pittsburgh's had a long time to prepare for this. I think that it's not as though they wake up on Monday morning and go, oh man, tough weekend in Edmonton and Calgary. Now what do we do? I think that they've been preparing behind the scenes for this inevitability or likelihood. But now there has to be complete clarity, within that organization about which way they go. And, it's a difficult thing to see. I mean, Guentzel was part of these most 2 recent Stanley Cup wins. Obviously, he's enjoyed a ton of success there. Homegrown player for the Penguins. And, I think all things being equal, he would probably prefer to stay in Pittsburgh. It's been his home as an adult, but his timeline and what he needs to make things work contractually doesn't line up with where the organization's at this stage. And I think he's going to be the first of multiple players that they're going to reach that sort of conclusion with as time goes along. Now that it's pretty clear they need to get younger, open the windows a little bit in the organization, let the fresh air in. And, it could take some time, right? I mean, ultimately, I don't think they're going into some full scale rebuild here, but, much like you've seen with Washington's kind of started to do, even going back to last year, ushering out some pretty notable players and trying to infuse the organization with some younger pieces coming up. I don't think that doesn't tend to happen in a year or two type of window. And so I think this is the start of a significant transition period for the Penguins. I don't know how much business they'll get done this week. As I mentioned, they're not sort of chock full of, obvious players to sell. I always hold up Seattle heading into this deadline, but a team like Seattle has 5 or 6 pretty established pending UFAs. If they get to a point where they want to sell, they could significantly overturn a portion of their roster. I don't know that Pittsburgh's in the same spot, but when you're talking about trading Sidney Crosby's winger, and the player's number 1 on the trade board, it's a pretty important decision that's in front of Kyle Dubas right now.
I don't know if you saw on social media some of the reactions from Pittsburgh Penguins fans, just generally looking at their team and how they handled this weekend. Like it feels as if they're anticipating another set of dark years for this franchise. They've been used to being among the best teams for almost the last 15, 20 years. Well, maybe a little less than 20 years, but you get what I mean. And I saw some of them mention guys like Rico Fata and the years preceding Sidney Crosby, saying, oh man, it's going to be reminiscent of those times. And I can't help but wonder how Sidney Crosby feels about hitching his wagon on this team that has shown it's not good enough to compete with the beasts of the Eastern Conference, let alone what they've got going on in the West.
It's a fair question, and it's one that's being asked, I think, in a lot of corners at this point in time, Julian. I would say this, having a chance to get to know Sidney Crosby over the years, he is not the sort of person that would be the first out the door at the sign of trouble. And, I don't think there's any reason for anyone to even just talk about March 8th when it comes to a big decision for Sidney Crosby. I mean, clearly this summer he's got to make a decision, or likely there's going to be conversations about his future because he can sign an extension as of July 1st. I would fully expect the Penguins will do whatever he wants to do. If he does get to a point where he thinks it might be a good time to go somewhere else, I'm sure they would accommodate him with that, but that just doesn't seem to be how the man is built, how he approaches things. I think he's a creature of habit. I mean, look, so much of what the Pittsburgh Penguins are, and he didn't act alone, but it's because of what he's been to that organization for 19 years now. I mean, 19 years is a long time. We're talking more than half of Sidney Crosby's life. He's been part of the Penguins. I mean, they're family to him. And, he's also someone who's won 3 Stanley Cups. I'm not saying that he's done winning. I mean, he's obviously an uber competitive guy. To have the kind of career longevity he's had, to be performing as well as he has this year at age 36. I mean, he's driven. I don't think anyone with a brain could question that. I think it's going to be a hard thing for him to work through. I think there's probably, in the emotions of the season, I mean, Pittsburgh's playing again tomorrow. Like I imagine he's just going through his day-to-day, looking after his body, focusing on the games, trying to give all he can to the team. But I think there's going to have to be a period of reflection on the other side of this season about where the organization's heading, if he's comfortable with that. It's a hard thing. I mean, he would obviously tell you he wants to stick around and be there when the Penguins are good again. Do you know who else wanted that? Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews in Chicago. And, both those men have moved on. And Toews' case, obviously, is away from the game because of his health challenges. But Patrick Kane's on his second team post-Chicago, and the Blackhawks are still at the bottom of the standings. Henrik Lundqvist years ago wanted to do that with the Rangers, and he didn't manage to stick around long enough to see where they are back now, ready to win. I mean, unfortunately for Henrik, it's on the other side of his playing window. And I do think that reality is one that can be difficult for players to get their minds around, just how long it takes. Maybe Pittsburgh will defy the odds. I don't think it's likely. I mean, look at the plain hard facts here. The Penguins played into the last week of last year's regular season with a chance to make the playoffs. I mean, they literally played meaningful games right till game 82 when they missed out. This year, they make a big offseason trade. They're trading first-round pick for Erik Karlsson and plus. They're signing free agents. Kyle Dubas was very active, and they are now 10 points out. Like, they have taken a step back, and Sidney Crosby's having perhaps the best 36-year-old season in NHL history, certainly among them.
Yeah.
I don't see a reason that we could argue they're going to be more competitive next season. I mean, they will make changes, of course. And that if Sidney Crosby is on board with staying, and I think that's the likely outcome. Like, I should be very clear on this. Like, we're having kind of a hypothetical discussion at this point. But
absolutely,
there's going to be turnover in the bottom six, and Kyle Dubas will do what he can to make the team more competitive. I'm just not sure that there's any reason for any of us to think that they're going to come back next year in 24-25 and be a better version of what they are. I mean, all their good players are getting a year older in that time, and and it's at the scary age where it's just like at any point in time, Malkin could just really be an ineffective player as opposed to a semi-effective player. Just because of aging curves and what happens and the toll that these guys have put their bodies through and all those things, injuries and everything else. So, if you're Sidney Crosby, are you on board with knowing next year the playoffs are going to be difficult? Like that's probably the ceiling of the team, is just somehow finding their way in. That's where it gets difficult, because I don't know how much longer Sidney plans to play. Obviously, he's got one more year after this one guaranteed on his current contract. He looks to me like the sort of player, if he's motivated and has, hopefully he's fortunate with his health, he could play another 3 or 4 years. I don't think that's crazy. I mean, we've seen the Jaromir Jagrs, play into their 40s and have great seasons. I think that he's capable of that, just given who he is and the ability he still has today. But, it's hard to do that on a team that's losing, 6-0, 6-1. And I know that's not every loss for the Penguins this year. I mean, they actually still have a positive goal differential. So, they've, which is a little strange. And most of the teams on the wrong side of the playoff cutoff line on both the East and the Western half, are negative goal differential teams. But, I think that this is going to be a moment of truth for this organization. I mean, this is undeniably, they've taken a step back. They didn't expect to be here, right? Like, there's a top 10 protection on the first round pick that San Jose owns from Pittsburgh, but you don't trade your 2024 first round pick expecting to be out of the playoffs. I'm sure they knew it was, a worst case scenario outcome. This has been pretty close to worst case, I think, in Pittsburgh this season, just because they've been out of, when were they last in a playoff spot? In December, they were chasing, and they've never fully caught up. I know they had a nice run in January, reeled off some wins, but they never actually got back to being in a playoff spot. I mean, they just kind of are what they are. And I know the margins are thin in this league, and you probably look at, they're looking at this much closer than you and I are on a day-to-day basis, right? They're probably looking at their positive goal differential. They're looking at some of the underlying numbers. They're thinking that they're not that far off, but the standings ultimately don't lie in the end. And I honestly, I felt a twinge of sadness. It's not like I'm some big Penguins fan or anything, but just watching that weekend, those weekend games, right? I mean, that's where you blow the lead in Calgary in the third period, and then you get blown out the next night in Edmonton. Look, that's a tough back-to-back. The Flames have been playing really good hockey the last stretch of games. Edmonton, has been awesome basically since the first or second week of November. I'm not saying that those losses individually tell us a whole story of what they did is hammered home exactly where the Penguins are. and where they are is a place they haven't been in a long time. And so I can get why fans are out there. Back to the original spirit of your question, what is this going to look like? Like, yeah, they're going to, the salary cap is undefeated. Detroit made the playoffs for 25 straight years, and they're only just now, 7 years, 8 years out, just now in a position where it looks like the Red Wings are going to get back. I mean, and that was a long time. Like, you saw disinterest creep into that market because it's hard to, when you've had that much success and then the team is just sort of, you don't know where it is. I mean, my old line, Julian, selling hope or selling wins. That's it.
Yeah.
Like Pittsburgh can't sell hope just yet because you have to start trading the pieces away. You have to draft some players people get excited about, but even after you draft them, it might be another year before they're joining your lineup. And then it's another 2 years before they're really impactful players. Like and fans get tied up in that, right? But I mean, because you get excited around it. I remember being around it here in Toronto. It's one season where like the Leafs draft Nylander, but then he's still in the American Hockey League. And even all those initial years in the NHL, like it's taken him a long time to be the player that's sixth in league scoring right now. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be winter is coming in Pittsburgh. And I say that even as we hit March, because there's going to be a barren period. I don't see any way around it. It's the way the system is designed to be. And, I think that the Penguins will not do necessarily the full scale tear down that we've seen elsewhere, because I think there's a lot of perils with that. I mean, you don't want to get really bad because it takes a lot to get good again after you've been really bad.
Yep.
And so that's what they're going to have to grapple with this offseason. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. I mean, I think in the short term here, it's pretty clear. It's sell whatever veterans you can sell, whether it's bottom six pieces. If someone wants Noah Chari, if someone wants Lars Eller, I do know there's interest in Riley Smith, who's got one more year in his contract of $5 million. You sell Jake Guentzel, and then you reassess in the offseason. But yeah, I think Sidney Crosby is, if I had to put odds on it, is likely to spend his whole career as a Penguin. I just think he's an extremely loyal guy. He's had so much success there. I can get why he's comfortable, but what a storyline it would be if he ended up playing somewhere else, especially while
you're in the
so
same
effective.
boat as me with that last part.
Yeah,
you're in that same boat with me with that, because like for me, I've said on this episode, I still can't see him getting moved. What I will say though is, if the offseason comes around and from wherever, whether it's you or someone else, like genuine discussions are being had about his future, about whether or not he wants to move, that turns into one of the biggest storylines the NHL has seen in a long time. Even if this is a guy entering his age 37 season, that's the talking point for the entire summer.
Of course, because if he signs somewhere or if he gets traded or whatever, however the machinate, I guess it would be a trade in this case. He's under contract, but he's going to a contender. Like we can safely say if he leaves Pittsburgh, he's definitely, if he's going to take that huge step in his life and his career, he's going somewhere he believes he can win. So one of the best teams in the league is adding him. And then the questions are, how effective can he still be? How does he fit in? What's it like just him playing somewhere where he isn't maybe the man, where, he's been the man in Pittsburgh since he was the kid, right? Like he took over that team. He was named captain after his first season there. He's been the absolute heart and soul fabric of that organization for so long. Like I bet he can't even imagine a world somewhere else. But if he peeks behind that curtain and he goes, I'm with you. Look, I would never hold it against any athlete who makes that decision in his shoes, by the way. Because like, I think of Jerome McGinley, still a legend in Calgary, right? But absolutely. He had a little world tour at the end of his career trying to chase a cup. Wasn't successful in getting it, but he played in multiple places, and I don't think anyone begrudges him for it. He's still welcome back as a Flames legend, can work for the team. I think that the same door would be extended to Sidney Crosby. If he, as weird as it would be to see him in other colors, if he wants to retire in Pittsburgh, if he wants to go work for the Penguins, if he wants to own the team, whatever, I don't know what his ambitions are beyond playing, but he could do all those things and nobody would bat an eye, I think. I mean, really, it's pretty rare the athlete that spends one whole career in one place. I mean, Mario Lemieux did it, but part of that might have also just been because of the health issues and all the things, he had time off. Had he been healthy that whole time, perhaps he would have went somewhere else. I mean, Jaromir Jagr, look at the ceremony they just had for him. And he's played, he's still playing, but he played many, many years, and he played for many, many teams in different countries and continents. I mean, I just think that fans will still love him unconditionally if he does it. I don't know if he's ever going to get there, though. I mean, did you see the answer he had post game, by the way, in Edmonton? He was asked about the trade. He was asked about the trade deadline, and I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it was clear he doesn't even want to entertain the idea of all the stuff we talked about at the start of the segment about trading his teammates.
Well, that
away.
makes sense.
Like makes
sense considering what he said to Rob Rossi a couple weeks ago too.
Right. He's so in it. He so just wants to believe that they're, right around the corner from an 8-game winning streak. And they still have some games in hand. Like, it's not impossible. I just think it's the writing's on the wall. It's hard to put together an 8-game winning streak because they're kind of at best middle of the road team. And at worst, they're a bottom 10 team in the league. And man, if they finish in the slot where they get the 11th overall pick, that goes right to San Jose. They don't get any say in it.
I'll say this, I in terms of getting ahead of ourselves, and I think we're trying to do a good job of showing restraint on that. I think it's only a matter. I think it's already started where other people are not showing that restraint. I fully expect, and I don't mean to put this into his head, but I fully expect like producer Drew to put together like a Photoshop of Sidney Crosby wearing a Colorado Avalanche jersey, playing alongside his buddy Nathan McKinnon. Someone's going to do it.
And that's probably what makes the most sense, right? If he were ever to go, he's got to go somewhere where there's comfort. And I think there'd be a lot of comfort in playing with Nathan McKinnon. I mean, it would be cool. Look at like LeBron has. It would be amazing. Now the NBA is totally different. I get it, but like LeBron has his success, right? He's played all over the place, and he went back to Cleveland, and
won in Cleveland.
Exactly. Like I don't see anything wrong with it. I think it's just realistic. No. Now you're talking to a guy who's worked basically everywhere you can work in Canadian sports media. So maybe I'm influenced by the fact, right? Like maybe I'm influenced by the fact that I actually think sometimes a change can be healthy for you. I think it can energize you. I think it can do something for his career. I mean, that Sidney Crosby, I mean, he's staying on at least one more season beyond his contract because he's going to be at the 2026 Olympics. He's going to do everything he can to put himself in position to be the captain of that team, to go for a third Olympic gold medal. So at minimum, I think he's got the year after this one and the year after that minimum. And as I say, like, I think he can play well beyond that if his heart's in it and if his health holds up. So he might have to go somewhere else to find that competitive juice, to be at his best, to push himself. I think his mind though, that's going to be a real, like, I bet he's like never even thought about it. Because that's the way
I'm going to believe that.
That's the way you have to be. I mean, first of all, he's been on a team even up until last year that every year you're like, okay, maybe the Penguins can go on a run. Like they've never been in this position. It's kind of the point I'm hammering home. Like even last season they missed the playoffs, but it wasn't the same as this. Like the writing has been on a wall for a long time, and this road trip just sealed it about where this team is this year, and it's further back than it's ever been since Sid's rookie year. And so like this is the first time these conversations are being had like out in public, because it's starting to become real. Right. And so, I think that will be the adjustment. I remember years ago when Daniel Alfredsson left Ottawa and he signed in Detroit, it was kind of a surprise, right? Like right up until the end, even though he was a free agent, everybody just assumed it was going to get worked out. I mean, franchise legend, Daniel Alfredsson, I know he's now on the coaching staff of the Senators, but he's continued to live in Ottawa the whole time. Like Ottawa was truly home for him. And I remember him saying something to the effect of, it got to that window when they still had the window where you could, talk to other teams. And all of a sudden he's like talking to other GMs and coaches, and he's like imagining himself in another uniform. And he kind of said something to the effect of, he remembers like when he opened the door and looked through it for the first time, like imagined what his world would be. It was almost like he couldn't go back. Once he allowed himself to think like, wow, what would it be like to play somewhere else? And he went and played the last 2 seasons in Detroit. And I think the same could be true of Sidney. Like, I bet he's never really even thought about it for more than like a second, or someone might've made a joke. One of his buddies might make a joke to him over a beer one day or whatever. But I bet he's actually never sat down as a productive exercise and been like, where else would I play? But if he gets to that point this offseason, I mean, could be interesting. I think a lot has to happen between then and now. And man, here we are 4 days from the trade deadline, and we're talking about a trade that we don't think is likely going to happen, but it could happen. And if it happened, it would be crazy. In the summer. But
we know that if it gets to that point, and I know we ran long on this segment, but I think it's well worth it, because we know that if it ever gets to a point where it's a genuine possibility, it's the biggest story in the league. Absolutely. But I'm glad we spent all that time talking about Sidney Crosby, because it's a very interesting time for him and the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Do you have a dark horse team? Do you have a dark horse team where you would like to see him, or where you think it would be cool other than, Colorado, I think is obvious. I think most people see that as the likely spot.
Okay, a dark horse team. It's got to be the Montreal Canadiens then. His boyhood team. They're a team that's trying to, eventually ascend to that next level. And I know they're not a direct contender, but if Sidney Crosby's going to envision himself playing somewhere else, and if there's an opportunity to say, hey, you know what? I played for the team I enjoyed watching as a kid. Maybe that's that one opportunity, right? Like you end your career playing for that team you grew up watching. I would put them as a dark horse team.
Yeah, that would be mine too. Actually, I just think it would be. This is the hockey romantic in me. That's just like, how cool would it be to have him on Hockey Night in Canada every week, to have him playing at the Bell Center. Obviously the Habs could still use a little bit of help down the middle. Like, I just think that it would make some sense on paper. I don't know if it makes sense in reality for him though.
This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by Shady Rays. Get ready for the season ahead with quality shades built to last. Our friends at Shady Rays have you covered with premium polarized shades that won't break the bank. Just so happen to have a pair over here of these great Oakmont shades. You can see the black frame up top. You can see the gold trim at the bottom here. Love these. Wearing these a lot in Calgary, especially where there's a ton of sun, even in the winter months. Shady Rays is an independent sunglasses company offering a world-class product rated 5 stars by over 300,000 people. Their shades have durable frames and crystal clear optics, making them the perfect choice for all outdoor adventures. They have lost and broken protection and free shipping and returns. So if you don't love your shades, exchange or return them for free within 30 days. There's no risk when you shop. Exclusively for our listeners, Shady Rays is giving out its best deal of the season. Head to shadyrays.com and use code Johnston for 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Try for yourself the shades rated 5 stars by over 300,000 people. This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by Liquid IV. Whether you hydrate to live or live to hydrate, Liquid IV quenches your thirst faster than water alone. With 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink plus 8 vitamins and nutrients for everyday wellness, all in a single sugar-free stick. Whether it's green grape, lemon lime, or white peach, the flavors are really good and the benefits are just amazing. 1 stick plus 16 ounces of water, so much better than just drinking water on its own. No artificial sweeteners, 8 vitamins and nutrients for everyday wellness. It has 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, and also non-GMO and free from gluten, dairy, and soy. However you hydrate, grab your Liquid IV Hydration Multiplier sugar-free in bulk nationwide at Costco, or get 20% off your first order when you go to liquidiv.com and use code Johnston at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code Johnston at liquidiv.com. Yeah, we'll definitely be talking more about Sidney Crosby as that story progresses. Again, we did run long on him, and we should spend time on some other teams on the trade board, like a team we've mentioned 100 million times before, the Calgary Flames, both with the second and third ranked players on your trade board in Jacob Markstrom and Noah Hanifin. I want to ask you about Jacob Markstrom. I have my thoughts on some of the comments of his that have surfaced. For context, for those who are not paying attention, on Friday, he was asked if he had parked the idea of being traded. There's been some trade speculation around him. He does have a no movement clause, but the New Jersey Devils are a team that has shown interest in him. I have the full quote to that question. I think everyone in here, every player in here, I really respect everything that's been going on and not going on. How everyone in this room, he means the dressing room, have handled everything. I think it's been really good. The whole situation and everything. Am I happy about that? No, I'm not. And I think it could have been handled a lot different from up top. I have my thoughts on it. I've been talking to colleagues about this all weekend. I would appreciate and love your perspective as an outsider to the Calgary market on Jacob Markstrom and how he feels about the talk around him and any other intel you can provide.
Well, this one's been messy, right? And
yes,
it's pretty clear that that's spilled out into the public only because of probably the stress and strain that's put on Jacob Markstrom. I think in a perfect world, what he wanted was this. Don't bother me with anything related to trade stuff unless come to me if you need, he has a full no movement clause. Come to me and be like, would you play in city X? We have a trade for you. Then he thinks about it with his family, his agents, what have you, makes a decision, and they move forward. I think that happened to a degree where a few weeks ago, the Flames and Devils trade talks got to a point where he was at least loosely asked or whatever. I mean, this is where semantics might come into it, but where he became aware of the possibility he could be a Devil and wanted to know, would you go to New Jersey? And I think he would be inclined to say yes to that. And then the trade didn't happen. And so I think it's been a bit of I don't think there was any maliciousness here on the part of Flames management or anything like that. But I do think that it's been a difficult thing for the player because he probably was thinking he wasn't going anywhere. Then he was thinking he was going somewhere. And now it looks like he might not be going anywhere. And, it's sort of like I was mentioning in the last little bit, there was like, he had to put his mind around like, hey, would I go play in New Jersey? Probably had to think, where would I live? What would my life look like? And he had to imagine all those things. And then it now, seems, unless there's a change here, that maybe it's not going to happen. And then amid all this, like this is maybe background noise, but it's kind of in the foreground. The Flames have just won 5 games in a row. And so I think it's becoming an exceedingly difficult position to trade Markstrom because, there's a world, even with all the guys they've taken off the roster already, and even with the likelihood that Noah Hanifin's moved by Friday, maybe they still get in with Markstrom. He's had a great season. I mean, he's certainly held up his end of the bargain, a bounce back year. I think you'd agree, probably the team's MVP this season. And,
absolutely.
I just wonder if it doesn't seem like Calgary's inclined to trade him now, even though they've definitely had those trade discussions and he would, to the point that they got to a level where he was made aware of them. So I think that's kind of how I see that whole scenario playing out. And, he's such you know him better than I do personally, Julian, but he's such a non-controversial guy, right? I mean, that's what stood out about that comment is that he's the last guy you'd almost expect to say something like that. And I think it's just a sign of where he's at. I mean, there's a lot of stress here and it's got to have been a tough year for the Flames. I mean, those guys,
absolutely,
half the roster has been on the trade board all year. We've already seen 3 guys traded out. There's still going to be at least one more and maybe more than that. And, the team's kind of hung tough despite that fact. It's almost like an FU to everyone. I mean, it's just, I'm sympathetic to the situation. And so that's my best read on what went down there. And I'd love to hear what you think.
So like the first person I think of regarding Jacob Markstrom is Chris Tanev. And over the last few days in Calgary, we've been talking to players and asking them how they've been adapting to Chris Tanev being gone. And I get it. Chris Tanev is a second pairing guy on the team. He was that. He's playing with Noah Hanifin. He's not a guy who's going to rack up a lot of points. He's a defensive defenseman. But people in that locker room, they loved Chris Tanev. Beloved figure in that room. And whenever he was on the ice for that team, they knew he could be that steady, positive influence. That team misses him. And I think there are guys in that room who are genuinely shook at the fact that he's gone. We knew that he was a pending UFA and there was a chance that he would leave, but I think that affected them. Like they had to address it. It got to that point with this team. Could you imagine with the work that they've done to this point, even though they're still behind a bunch of teams for a playoff spot? Could you imagine trying to get over Chris Tanev being gone and then Jacob Markstrom being gone? Like, I don't know if this team comes back from that. And I think that really changes up the morale on this team. And that's a genuine thing that Craig Conroy has to deal with this squad. I mean, it's one, I think with Elias Lindholm being gone, I think at least the way it's been voiced, it's just maybe just one of those guys who maybe needed to leave. Nikita Zadorov, when he had to leave, there was the trade request. He had to go. I think the way the players handled that, it's a bit of a different situation. Chris Tanev, he's just meant so much to that team. And even if he might have anticipated the fact that he'd be leaving, I don't think the team, they reacted very differently to that than I think they did for Elias. As much as, yes, he did have friends in that locker room, but I think it's a different atmosphere. And I think if Jacob Markstrom leaves, yeah, that's going to change the team in a completely different way. Because as you said, he's the team's MVP. There are guys who have gone out of their way to say he's a top three goaltender in this league, especially with the way he's been playing this year. I don't think the Flames recover from that. And I think a lot of questions would have to start being asked about who would want to stick around for this transitionary period that this team looks as if they're going to enter, whether it's through the deadline or whether it's through the summer. So there's a lot of questions to be asked. And I think that if Jacob Markstrom moves, which at first I thought maybe was happening, then I thought I don't think it's happening. After those comments, I'm very much up in the air about it.
Well, here's what I'll say.
Is a big domino. Yes.
It's clear he wants to move. I think it's clear. You don't say that about your GM unless you want to move. I just don't know if it happens by Friday. But to me, the writing is on the wall that the odds of him being the Flames goaltender come next October, I think, are extremely slim. And
I'll say this too. You finish.
Do you know what the Tanev move is? The Tanev move to the players, and I think this is exactly what you're saying, it's a reminder that the organization's interests maybe aren't aligned with their own. And you can't fault Craig Conroy. I mean, he's trying to manage these players like assets. He's trying to make sure they get, something back for Chris Tanev, that they can move forward with someone who wasn't ultimately going to sign there, who wants to go chase a Stanley Cup, as is his right. But, to everyone else in the room, it's like, okay, well, if that's what's best for the team, maybe being on the team isn't what's best for me. And, there's certain players in that dressing room that have huge, huge contracts that I just think are going to be near impossible to move at this stage. But someone like Jacob Markstrom is an exception. He's got 2 more years on his deal at $6 million, but he's performing at a level that there are teams beyond New Jersey, if we're talking about the summertime now, and so we're not talking about the realities of in-season cap and all that I think would certainly be interested in trading for a Markstrom. So, he surges up the trade board here because of his comments, because I think it's the first real confirmation we got that he's not on board for the long term in Calgary. I don't know what's going to happen these next few days. I mean, I think it's hard to trade him, quite honestly. Like if the Flames beat Seattle, make it 6 games in a row, get a little closer to the wild card race, I just think it's hard to put the white flag up on the season. And as much as they've traded some talent out the door, the white flag isn't up on the season until you trade Markstrom. I think if you trade Markstrom, there's no chance you're making the playoffs.
Absolutely.
So that's where we're at. And it's pretty compelling. I mean, what was it like in the scrum? Like when you said it, were you surprised? Did you pick up on it? Like sometimes in the moment you don't pick up on something like that. Like what was the moment?
Oh
like?
Yeah. Immediate. Here's the thing. Like the early part of that press conference, it's funny. We haven't mentioned this at all. Mika Kiprusoff has his number 34 retired. And one of the biggest reasons why we wanted him in that scrum was because he did mention that Kiprusoff was a goalie he watched growing up. And then it got to a point where we asked him questions about losing Chris Tanev, and that's been his boy. They've played together in Vancouver. They played together in Calgary. That's like his favorite teammate. And he waxed poetic about him. And you could tell he missed him. Just speaking to my earlier point about how much this team really loved having Chris Tanev on that team. And that was like the last question. The quote I just read out, that's the last quote he said. And of course, we're discussing it now in the fact that it's a shot at the front office, but there's a genuine debate being had about whether or not he specifically meant Craig Conroy, or if this is Craig Conroy and people above him, like going up to ownership, because it is entirely possible that maybe Craig Conroy put that trade out there and maybe went upstairs and wondered, hey, like, could we do this? And they thought, well, no, we're how many points out of a playoff spot? We can't make this move. Maybe it's not just Craig Conroy.
Here's the thing, though.
What I'm saying.
I understand the debate, but if you're in Jacob Markstrom's shoes or skates, it doesn't matter. Like you don't care whether it's ownership or management. Like they have to figure that out amongst themselves. All he means by up top is the people that make the decisions. And in every organization that looks a little different, and there's different, hierarchies and all this stuff. But whoever makes that decision could have handled this better. That's, I think, ultimately, if you're the player, you're just like, I don't, sort your shit out up there and do this properly. So
I don't think we can title this show "Sort Your Shit Out," but we can at least try. But yeah, that's essentially what's going to have to happen with Jacob Markstrom and the Calgary Flames. We haven't even gotten to Noah Hanifin in his file. That's a player who has been near the top of the trade board for the last how many months. It really looks like he is going to leave. This is a team that is days away from having their entire second pairing of Noah Hanifin, Chris Tanev, or maybe you view him as the team's top pairing, gone. And they're going to have to adjust with that. They have depth on defense, but losing Noah Hanifin, who just set a single season high for himself in goals, and Chris Tanev, who I've already mentioned before, that's tough for this team. And teams like Tampa Bay and Florida and maybe Boston, we've linked New Jersey last week to Noah Hanifin. Let's talk about that situation as we continue to go in on the burn that is the Calgary Flames.
Yeah, I think the Hanifin, he actually drops on the trade board because it's been a slow-moving file. I think that it's not the lack of interest in him, but it's just the price it's going to cost, the fact that he does have some control with his limited no trade clause and the knowledge that there's only a certain number of places he's likely to sign an extension. And, when you get into a trade that involves an extension with the player, there's obviously more machinations involved. And, I'm certainly not predicting he's not going to be moved, but it's not been easy. It's not been as easy as moving Chris Tanev was, or even Elias Lindholm. And so, I think that he ultimately ends up in one of these places. I don't buy the Florida talk, by the way. I don't see the Panthers making that move. As far as I can tell, there's not much there. The Tampa thing, which we've talked about, I think a couple times on the show, is real. They've obviously got the money in terms of the cap space for Sergachev short term. I think that he'd be interested in signing their longer term. I don't know how that works because the Lightning don't have a lot of cap space moving forward. And obviously they have a big decision pending on their captain, Steven Stamkos, this summer. Boston is interested in the player, but really doesn't have a lot of assets, doesn't have a lot of cap room. So that maybe is if he gets to July 1st free agency, I think that's a team to watch. And so this is kind of the problem. I mean, it's a weird market this year, right? One thing we probably haven't discussed enough, a lot of the teams that we would have in the buyer category have been buying for years. And so they're all down draft picks, right? Like teams like Florida and Boston and Toronto and others, the Rangers, they've all traded a lot of picks in the last couple, deadline periods. So they all feel a little depleted from an asset standpoint. It's not to say those teams won't still be buying, but they don't have the same powder to buy that they had in some of the years gone by. And so we have some weird market conditions, I think, or some unique market conditions that are here at this year's deadline. And so that all factors into Hanifin. I mean, maybe the return ends up being not as strong as what you'd think. And part of that is just like these teams don't have as many picks to trade or the quality that they have in the past. And so, yes, Hanifin's not re-signing in Calgary. Craig Conroy said right from the start of the season, he's getting assets back for those guys. But I think he's going to have to grind out these next few days to make a deal that looks good on paper. And and as you mentioned, it's going to be another blow to the team. But I think at this stage, unless you're living under a rock in the Flames dressing room, I think you understand. You better enjoy your last morning skate with them here soon, because there's not going to be many more.
Yeah, and I'll say this: there's a large section of fans who have been welcoming this type of change. And they do not want to be in the muddy middle anymore. And they have seen it where this team has tried to make the playoffs from the position that they're in. And they'd much rather see these players, these pending UFAs, leave so they can get worse and maybe get a better first round pick. Or if a Noah Hanifin trade comes to fruition and they get the assets they want, get as many first round picks as they can get. Maybe you package them for a better pick, or you just use them all so they can get out of the situation that they're in. It's one thing to look at the players, and I understand what they're feeling, but there are fans in Calgary who've been waiting for this. They've been waiting for this type of, even if it's just going to end up being a retool, there are fans that want this.
I get it. I mean, they're not cup favorites, right? They're not a team.
Nope.
They had one season or two seasons where you might have viewed them, like the last year, certainly, of Tkachuk and Gaudreau there. There's a lot of, I think, justified optimism about what could happen, but like they scaled up, but they never quite just got scaled up high enough. And now that era's over, right? I mean, Sean Monahan's playing in Winnipeg, Johnny Gaudreau's playing in Columbus, Matthew Tkachuk is taking the Florida Panthers to the Cup final, and a star of a team that could go there again this year. I mean, this is the cycle of sports, and so it's time for the next cycle in Calgary.
All right. We've gone in on the Penguins. We've gone in on the Flames. Let's try to go in on the rest of the Canadian teams, at least ahead of the trade deadline. We could start with the Toronto Maple Leafs. We know they made a move a couple days ago. They acquired Ilya Lyubushkin. He already gets himself into a game. There was the hit from Matt Rempe that I know some people in Toronto and around the league were talking about a lot, especially with those two characters. I'm very curious what is to come from Brad Treliving and the Toronto Maple Leafs. I've said it before, with the season that Austin Matthews is having, you can't waste that season. I'm very curious what they do, if they can do more ahead of the Friday deadline.
The Leafs are going to do more. I mean, you don't trade for Lyubushkin and put his contract through a third party to get it below the league minimum salary if you're not preserving your cap space for future moves, right? I know it's just a 4th round pick that went to New Jersey as part of that move, but you're still not tossing 4th round picks out the window willy nilly in the Leafs position. I mean, they were doing that to make sure they have some cap space left. I think that you should look for them to trade for another defenseman, probably one that can play on the right side. And they're going to look for another depth forward too. I don't think that any of these will be what we would call a seismic deal or, necessarily a headline grabber out of the Leafs, but they're not going to stop at the Lyubushkin, acquisition. And unfortunately for him, he gets injured in the first game. He's got a head injury, from that Rempe hit.
Tough
and so,
hit.
I mean, tough 72 hours. I mean, just to get traded, to fly across the country, to jump right into a game, and then to get injured in short order is a difficult period for him. But, I think the Leafs will be still kind of tinkering on the edges, we would call it. But, they're looking at a whole bunch of guys. I mean, Brad Treliving's known for being, a first-class tire kicker, someone who really works the phones a lot and understands what the market is, from every angle. I've heard the Leafs connected to Zach Bogosian, who they've obviously had before. Minnesota's trying to re-sign Bogosian still, but, with where the Wild are at, if they're not able to do that in the next couple of days, I would think he's a strong candidate to be moved. Matt Dumba, I think, makes some sense for the Leafs, especially, after that Tanev package ends up being a 2nd rounder. I think it's kind of sets the market for a player like Dumba. Maybe he ends up as a 3rd round pick, which, if you get into that territory and you're the Leafs, maybe that's something you could make work. Although the Leafs are obviously very short on draft capital here. But I think that they're open to moving their 1st rounder, but it's got to be under perfect conditions. And so, I guess my high level takeaway for Toronto is that they're going to still boost the depth. But, one thing we haven't talked about is they're 9-1 in their last 10 games. I mean, something is clicking here, and they've particularly found a lot of success since John Tavares was moved down to the 3rd line. They've maybe spread their offense out a little differently. I thought the Tavares line had a great game in Saturday's win over the Rangers. And, Austin Matthews isn't scoring a goal and a half a game anymore, but they've still been winning without him giving that level of contribution he did for about 3 months in a row of the season there. And so, I think that Leaf fans should expect a little bit more action, but, more around the margins type of stuff, and, see where they end up. The irony of all of this is that it feels like they have fewer needs than maybe a month ago, just because something has clicked with the roster and they've managed to compile such a successful run here.
Is the Leafs 1st round pick in play with any of their trades?
For sure it is. I think that they haven't boxed themselves into thinking that we're not moving the 1st rounder. I just think it's not likely to be moved for a rental type player. So, maybe if there's, maybe they end up making a move for a defenseman with some term on his deal, and then the 1st rounder makes sense to be part of it. I mean, if they go out and trade for David Savard in Montreal, for example, who signs through next year, I think it becomes easier to rationalize that kind of an expense if it's someone who's going to help a little longer term, because the Leafs are moving into an offseason where they actually are going to have a little bit of flexibility. I mean, they're losing the whole cap jump will basically be swallowed up with the raise to Austin Matthews and raise to William Nylander that kicks in next season. But, they're losing a player like TJ Brody, most likely, who's a pending UFA. They're going to have to refresh the lineup again. You've also got Tyler Bertuzzi and Max Domi as pending UFA. So there's the Leafs do have some money to play with when you're talking about acquiring a player who has term beyond this year. And so I think that's the most likely outcome. But, it's a little soon to say if or when that's going to happen. But when you're asking, would they do it? They 100% would do it for the right player in the right circumstance.
Okay. There goes Leafs corner again. Let's go through the rest of the Canadian picture. Anything on let's pick a city. Let's go to Vancouver. They re-signed Elias Pettersson a couple of days ago. What else could they be doing ahead of the deadline?
Well, I mean, that's a big piece of business. It's a sign of the times that we're getting to that this deep into the show, given that's the richest contract in club history that was signed on Saturday. And, I think with Pettersson, the sense I got from my calls around the league in the last 24 hours or so is a lot of people really like the work Vancouver did on that contract, that they feel that keeping him under 12 million on the AAV was a real win for them. And, obviously gives them now some certainty, another huge piece of their core locked in way into the future, allows them to do future business and understand where they're at, removes a question mark, removes a storyline, removes the every 2 days, a new storyline coming out about new rumor or new bit of speculation about Pettersson, during a season where obviously the Canucks are having a great year. And so, I think that they will look to add another forward still if they can, and maybe even a defenseman. I expect them to approach this deadline kind of with that all in sort of feel, just because, they haven't been in the playoffs the last few years. And this is the first time they've had that chance to do it since Jim Rutherford and Patrick Allvin took hold of the front office. And I do think they'll be aggressive where they can be. They have a lot of the same limitations as other teams in that they just don't have a huge amount of cap space. But, I think that let's look for them to make some moves. And they've already, to their credit, made some moves, bring in Zadorov and Lindholm, had a chance to get those players up and running. But, I think that they're still looking for a little more balance in their lineup too. And so, the biggest decision probably of them all is getting Pettersson signed and just removing any questions about that, knowing what the number is. But, I also don't think they're hanging up the phone on trade action. They're going to look to make some moves too.
I saw this one rumor or idea float around. Could you imagine Tyler Toffoli returning to Vancouver?
I could. I just don't know if they want to give up a first round pick to get him, which is probably what it's going to take. So, I don't know where Toffoli lands. I mean, you haven't asked about Edmonton yet. I think he's a player that has some appeal in Edmonton. They're obviously looking at forwards. I mentioned Guentzel. I think Henrique is someone that, we could connect to the Oilers in terms of them having interest on. And I think that they're keeping their minds open to whatever the best use of their first round pick is to acquire a forward. But, it's going to be an interesting few days here, because you got teams like Vegas, Edmonton, and then maybe even Vancouver bidding on some of the same types of players, or looking at the same types of players anyway.
So we can get to the Oilers. I know we mentioned them previously, but could we add Pavel Buchnevich to the list of players they might be interested in?
You can, yeah. I mean, certainly St. Louis is among the teams that Edmonton has scouted pretty extensively here in recent months. And, I think that the challenge with Buchnevich and could be a feature or a bug, depending how you look at it, is that he's signed beyond this year. And obviously Edmonton has a pretty tight cap sheet, and I think that they have to be careful with their longer term commitments. But it's definitely a player they like. The package it's going to take to get him sounds like it'll be more than what Vancouver paid for Elias Lindholm. And so that has to be factored into it. And I think ultimately, as you're looking through the names that Edmonton's sorting through, it's Buchnevich, it's Tarasenko, perhaps Eberle, Guentzel, Henrique. I mean, there's a lot of potential options for them. And I think it's, might be dictated which other teams come in and maybe grab some of those players first, or where they can get the best value back for the assets they're surrendering.
Okay. What about the Winnipeg Jets?
I think they're depth shoppers now. I mean, they've made a pretty big move by giving up a first round pick and getting Sean Monahan over the All-Star break. That's been a great fit, by the way. I mean, he's had a lot of success there. He's fit in as they would hope in the bumper position on their power play, giving them another option at 5-on-5 to bring more balance to the lineup. So, I think that's the big splash for the Jets. I could see them, adding a little bit more depth to the blue line, making a move there. And certainly a number of players that would fit the bill. But, Winnipeg traditionally is a team that wants to protect its draft picks. I mean, they've done a great job as an organization, really, since returning to Winnipeg in terms of drafting and developing players and finding talent, homegrown talent that way. And so I think that they'll be what I would call value shoppers at this point. Again, having already addressed their biggest need and been aggressive, I think they were smart to get it ahead of the Monahan deal and not wait till this point in time. It's just giving him chance to step into their lineup. They've put together a little win streak here, and I think he'll be more comfortable than had they were just brought him in, at the end of this week, right at the deadline. And so I think Winnipeg will be nibblers, but not getting all the airtime on Friday when James Duthie and the lights go up.
And CJ, as we wrap up our look through Canadian teams, let's talk about the two sellers in the Ottawa Senators and the Montreal Canadiens.
Well, pretty notable development in Ottawa, where it sounds like the action is picked up on Jacob Chikrin here with some of the defensive market shaking out, obviously the Tanev move, and, teams getting their minds around what they might do to address their needs there, that there's a little bit more calls coming into the Senators on that player. And, he's intriguing for a couple of reasons, still pretty young, and, he's signed through next year as well. So it's not a trade Ottawa feels they need to make by Friday, but I think it's one that's certainly a possibility. And, the Senators do have some potential issues on the left side long-term, because you've got Thomas Chabot signed, obviously Sanderson signed long-term, and with Chychrun only having one more year on his deal, I think it makes sense if there's a good return to move him now. The other big piece they have is Tarasenko, who, don't sleep on the season that he's had there for the Senators. Still a pretty effective scoring forward, built like a tank, built to play when the games get difficult to play, because he can be big and handle some physicality and win battles along the boards. And, I do think that he's one of the main targets for teams that maybe miss out on a Jake Guentzel. He can do a lot of the same kind of things, maybe not at quite the same elite level, but would expect that you're going to see him moved here in the days ahead. And so those are the two probably biggest decisions for Ottawa. They've got Dominique Kubalik as a expiring UFA as well, who I'd expect to be moved. In Montreal, kind of an interesting situation. I mean, the players that are generating the most interest are all signed beyond this year. And so there's no guarantee that any of them are moved. That includes Jake Allen, the goaltender, David Savard, and also Joel Armia, three players I think that the Canadians have taken some calls on, or seeing if there's anything out there for them. But, it might end up being a pretty quiet deadline in Montreal, just because they don't have the same type of players that we've seen in the past come these periods. And I think that'll just be dependent on where teams end up as we get closer to Friday. But the Canadians don't feel like they need to force anything, but they're certainly open for business if anyone wants to make a serious bid for any of those three players.
Okay, we got through a ton of hockey just now. It's time for Ask CJ. I will try my absolute best to ensure that we give you more fun, not hockey-related questions. Is that okay? Let's try this one from Congo Red. If you had to eat one culture's cuisine and live in one city for the rest of your life, what and where would that be?
So you have to live in the city in the country of the culture's cuisine kind of thing?
Yeah, essentially that.
I mean, my first thought when you said the cuisine was Italian. I haven't spent a ton of time in Italy. Like I was in Rome when I was like a backpacking teen, like early 20s someone, but I would probably have to go with Rome, I guess, just because I don't know, but I haven't visited other parts of the country. But that's my final answer. Though it was a big city. Maybe I should go somewhere a little more relaxed in Italy. Maybe the Italian Dolomites up in the north, and live in the mountains and eat Italian food all day.
Man, that sounds like a really good proposition. I just put me somewhere in Jamaica and I'll eat Jamaican delicacies like ackee and saltfish and dumpling for the rest of my life. I'm good with that. I'm okay with that. And hanging out by a beach. Just put me where there's good Wi-Fi. I'll make it work. From Big Leaf Sky, all the GM positions are vacant and you have 32 teams offering you that position. Which one are you taking and which one are you hanging up the phone first? So most desirable and least desirable.
I guess the spirit of the question is like, which team is best set up for success long term and probably a good place to live, plus. That's a hard question.
That's really tough.
I mean, it would be hard not to take the Chicago GM's post, wouldn't it?
You get Connor Bedard.
Right. And there's a lot of room for flexibility there to make moves. Like they're not locked in. I mean, Seth Jones has a long contract, but they have a pretty clean balance sheet, cap sheet for the next couple of years. They have lots of picks. Plus Chicago's a great city. I'm inclined to say Chicago. I'm trying to think of who else I might be sleeping on here. Who am I hanging up the phone for? Probably Pittsburgh.
Wow.
No, I just think it's a really tough job. I mean, we spent 20 minutes of this podcast going through why, but I just think it's a really tough position to be in. There's a reason Kyle Dubas.
So you don't want to be the guy to trade Sidney Crosby? Is that what you're saying?
Or just manage the situation, figure out how to, I think, they might be the furthest away in a weird roundabout way. I mean, it's not to say, it's just, they have no prospects, right? I mean, they're going to have a few more after this week, but I just think that look, they've had so much success. It's nothing. I'm not actually raining on their parade. I mean, Pittsburgh or San Jose. It's just at least San Jose has maybe started the process, but I still think San Jose is a long way away. That's no comment on the cities or the organizations, the ownership groups, nothing like that. But those are the two I wouldn't be that anxious to jump at. I wouldn't mind stepping in. Like, come on, there's all sorts of great teams in the league. I mean, Vegas has been well run. I could take over that sports car and probably keep it on the road. Colorado, Chicago, if you're looking longer term. That's kind of where my brain goes.
Okay. There are a few people in the comments who are asking about Jeff Carter's middle name. Do we entertain that today or no?
Well, you're the one with the scoop. So this is, I know you're in the host seat. So this is your call.
Scoop. What scoop are you talking about?
All I know is that Jeff Carter played a game in Calgary this weekend and you were at the game. So you could take it from there.
I mean, that's an assumption that I would have gone to the locker room and actually asked him that question.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'm good with leaving that there.
I have nothing to share. Like, nothing has changed on my end. You're the one who has a development. So it's all about whether you want to share it or do you want to hold it over the people?
I think I'm ready to go to the next question with that.
Okay.
One. I will plead the fifth. That's okay. Not today. Nice try, though. You tried it.
I literally have nothing to say. You brought it up. You're the one with the news, and I got no news. So,
no, you making it seem like I got news. Anyway. Producer Drew, why won't the Devils fire Lindy Ruff?
I mean, not a lot of coaching changes happened this late in the season. For one,
no,
didn't he just sign an extension?
I mean, last year the people were saying fire Lindy, we're sorry Lindy, and now everyone's here.
Well,
it feels.
And last I checked, Lindy doesn't put the pads on. Now he wouldn't be the first coach that could meet the untimely fate of a firing because of his goaltending, but I think charitably that's been a big issue for New Jersey this year, and that's why there's all this talk about Jacob Markstrom and maybe others, depending on how these next few days go.
And Lindy Ruff did sign a multi-year contract extension before the season.
So that's your answer. I mean, you believed in him in September or whatever that was. I mean, look at the team save percentage. But again, that's usually what happens with coaches. The coach who wins Coach of the Year usually has a great team save percentage too. So there's a direct correlation between those things, good and bad.
I love the fact that we just did an entire episode of CJ Show where we went in on Jacob Markstrom. We talked about Sidney Crosby. We went in on what the rest of the Canadian teams might do at the deadline and who they're linked to. And there will be fans listening to this podcast who will skip through all of that and be like, oh my God, these two know who Jeff Carter's middle name is and didn't bother to tell us.
That's all on you. Like, I hope any angry listener can now direct it at Julian, because I do not have the answer. So
Et tu, Brute? You're just at this point where we're just going to throw your host under the bus.
Yeah, because you're the one who's raising this.
I said, do you want to entertain it or not? And then you were just like, nah, bro, you got it. I said you didn't have to say yes. I give you the option.
I said that this is your call. You have the info. Anyway.
You said I have the scoop.
J.K. McKenzie, just throw any angry fan mail out there goes right to this guy.
Wow, reporter Chris, all this to ease off some pressure.
No, if I had the answer, I would give it by now.
Yeah. Tweet at reporter Chris, who was the GM who called the last episode. You might as well do that if we're going to play that game.
Just saying. This isn't a good sign. We're coming apart at the seams here, and we're not even through trade deadline. So
I think the trade deadline is breaking us apart. If anyone's noticed, for those watching on YouTube, the background that CJ is at is from the SDPN studios. So not only are you withholding information, you get to actually be on the Steve Dangle show, a show I said I wanted to be on a couple weeks ago, and through some extenuating circumstances, you are filling in for Steve. You might be coming from the Steve Dangle podcast to listen to our show, or you might not have listened to that Steve Dangle podcast episode yet, but go over to that and check out CJ on that show, because that's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I've been in this seat a lot of times with these guys, but it's been a little while, so I'm excited about it.
I'm looking forward to it, man. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope people realize, like, CJ and I are just having fun. Yeah. We don't have actual like smoke for each other on Jeff Carter. It's two friends teasing each other. That's what this is. I don't want anyone thinking that we hate each other anymore.
No, come on. Do you know what's funny? I had the other night. I was out with some friends, and someone yelled at me. I was like leaving this establishment, and someone yelled at me from the line. He's like, CJ, I love the pod, but I'm not 100%er. And I'm like, it's okay, bud. I love you too. I don't just love the 100%ers. If you're a 64%er or whatever, there's lots of love for you here too. So I'm just saying.
We'll be back later not next week. Goodness gracious, I'm tired. My bad. We'll be back later this week with more podcasts. Maybe there's an emergency podcast to do ahead of the NHL trade deadline. We will be on top of it here. And make sure to check out the SDPN YouTube channel and wherever you listen to podcasts for more when it comes to the big day, Friday, March 8th. Looking forward to seeing you on Screen Siege with TSN, of course, and also with us here. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back. Bye.
The Chris Johnston Show. Inside the game, twice a week. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris. And follow Julian McKenzie @JK McKenzie.